All right, let's get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Europe and Asia, Use of Open Banking. We have already 59 people joining the call. I'm sure other people will start joining while we go further. This webinar is part of a Zuhlke Innovation Series of webinar. So follow Zuhlke Engineering LinkedIn page to stay tuned on upcoming webinars. So today, over 160 people have registered to this webinar. And what I'd like to say that during this webinar today, we will be discussing use cases related to open banking across both Europe and Asia. Before we start, firstly, what I like to do is to thank the sponsor of this webinar, Zuhlke Engineering first, and the Fintech Association of Hong Kong. Second, I like to go through some of the housekeeping rules. So this webinar is held under the Chatham House rules. And what does it mean? That as a participant, you are free to use the information shared in this session, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers, nor that of any other participant in the webinar can be revealed. Hanu has, how you might have already probably seen, you've been mute by default in this conversation. So if you like to share your questions, we have shared with you a link previous to the webinar on Pigeonhole. So on that link, if you follow the link, you will be able to, and I think Lorraine from our team might be able to share the QR code with you on the screen. Lorraine, can we please share the QR code? Yes. So you will be able to basically scan the QR code or go to Pigeonhole. If you have not already rated the questions, you will be able to add more questions or vote the questions that we already pre-selected for you. There is also a poll that you can take, sharing which type of use cases you would like to basically hear about. We will also take more questions, obviously, but we will do that in the time that we have got available. So tonight, we have a great panel, which touches a few areas of open banking, starting from the banks and fintech to expert in financial services. All right, let's get started with the introduction. So before I move to the panelists, let me introduce myself. So my name is Antonio Tinto, and I'm from Zuhlke Engineering in Hong Kong, and I will be moderating the panel tonight. My experience goes from delivering a new digital proposition and digital transformation projects across a variety of industries. I've been working both corporate and startups, and I've been in Asia Pac for now about 15 years. My experience in open banking is more from a delivery side, is with more in the platform banking. And from regulatory perspective, it's been thanks to the Fintech Association of Hong Kong, I've been exposed to several conversations with regulators and banks. So let's start with the gatekeeper of open banking game, the banks. Tonight with us we have Gary Lau from Standard Chartered Bank in Hong Kong. Gary is Director of Open Banking and Innovation. Hi, Gary.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. So Gary, can you please take a minute to introduce yourself and share what's your experience with open banking?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Gary Lau. I'm from Standard Chartered Bank Hong Kong. So I'm the head of open banking and innovation here. I've worked in the banking industry for more than 15 years now. Originally based in Sydney, and then now I've been in Hong Kong covering corporate and retail banking digital kind of initiatives across Hong Kong and Asia Pacific. Lately, I've been focusing a lot of my time on open banking across commercial and retail initiatives.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks. So I'd like to move now to next panelist. We represent who is connecting basically the ecosystem to the banks, and which you might also know as a third-party provider. We have Mary Steinheiler, VP Asia Pac for TrueLayer. Mary, I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Almost. We'll give it a pass.
Thank you, Mary. Mary, can you please introduce yourself? What's your experience with open banking?
Sure. I look after APAC, as you said, at a company called TrueLayer. We are a technology enabler. We essentially are an aggregator that finds the best banking APIs and connects them and normalizes them so that startups, incumbents, anyone who needs the data or access to the infrastructure can do so easily. My background is in technology, so I've worked in a variety of technology startups at different stages of their life cycle over the last 10 years. And I got involved with open banking initially actually as a client of TrueLayer's, where I was working at an online finance company, and we wanted to use the data to do risk assessment and income validation. So I've seen it from that aspect, from that angle. First started looking into it in 2015. Launched our first product in 2018, and now with TrueLayer, I'm looking at how this is going to play out in this part of the world. So really excited about the conversation today.
Excellent. That's excellent. Thank you, Mary. So let's now move to the old continent and start with the player that is trying to disrupt the industry by bringing in a new customer proposition to the market. So we have from UK, Andrew Smith, CEO and the founder of Upside. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Antonio. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you here. So, Andrew, can you please introduce yourself and share what's your experience with open banking?
Yes, thank you. So I, like Antonio said, are the CEO and founder of UpsideSaving.com. We are going after the retail savings use case. One of the key things I suppose we'll get into is the various different use cases. I've got a big passion for savings. I grew up in South Africa, where at the time I was 10, I earned 17% interest on my savings account. And then that was the last of it ever, because after that I spent my life in the Northern Hemisphere. But that left such a big impression in me that I want to help other people achieve the same kind of notion of growth of their savings as I saw there.
Thank you, Andres. So let's move to the last but not least of our panelists, the financial service experts. We have Wolfgang Emery, CEO and founder of Zuhlke Engineering in UK. Wolfgang, hi. You're on mute, Wolfgang. Yeah.
Hi, Antonio. Thanks.
Hi. Can you please short introduce yourself and your experience with open banking?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So as Antonio said, I co-founded Zuhlke in the UK, and our main office is based in London. And given where we are, it's not surprising that the bulk of our clients are actually in finance and in banking. So over the years, we've done sell-side and buy-side work. We've worked in asset servicing, and over the last 4.5 years, we've actually done a lot of work in retail banking, which is where we came into contact with PSD2, which is the European flavor of open banking. PSD2 is the Payment Services Directive, and the second variant of the EU. And for one large bank, that's actually a global bank, also present in Hong Kong, we have done work on helping them implement open banking, and in particular the authentication that's required, and the access control that's required in open banking. So I'm happy to answer any questions around the security side. I also have a general interest in fintechs. So over the years, we've worked with a fair number of startups, in fintech. And again, some of these are now touching open banking. And interestingly, this is not only in finance.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you. So I'd like to share with the audience here why we came up with this webinar on open banking. So we keep on hearing from the client here at Zuhlke. So this topic and interest in open banking, but also it's a growing topic within the community across the world. So just for the benefit of the audience, I'd like to share quickly. So what essentially one critical point, right? That there's some of the countries, basically, some of you might already know that they're taking different approaches. So, for instance, in the UK, in Europe, we have a mandate approach where the regulator essentially sets the pace, and in market like Asia and US is more market driven mostly, but not all the countries take that approach. But let's focus on use case, right? On the essentially in the past few months, given the COVID-19, there has been a lot of discussions about open banking usage being boosting up, and I would like to have the view from the old continent, starting from Wolfgang, or what are you seeing in the market in terms of interesting use cases?
Yeah, so we followed that with interest, and initially the use cases were that banks were trying to offer customers a holistic view of their financial position, even across different institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So you can now, when you bank with Barclays, you can see your accounts at HSBC and other banks, and there was a second wave, and this was basically put in place relatively quickly after PSD2 was introduced. So Barclays had an offering, HSBC had an offering called Connected Money that came out pretty much a few months after PSD2 and the implementations were widely available.
Mm-hmm.
What we're seeing now is that fintech startups are offering analytics on customer behavior. So with Revolut, for example, you can now see your spend and your spending patterns across multiple different banks, and they classify the spend so that you can see a holistic view of where your money goes, regardless on what account it comes from. And we now have startups like Andres' startup, and I'll let Andres talk about what they do, who actually go yet a step further. And I think what we will see in the next phase is open banking APIs and implementations being used actually outside fintech. And we can drill down on that in due course. So this is basically where I think we are.
Yeah, I like to say essentially, started from basically aggregating the accounts and then moving to today to actually, account aggregators probably existed even before the open banking thing actually started, and now moving towards really data analytics. And I like actually Andres moving to you now. So what is that? What is the value prop that you guys are working on?
And just before I do that, I mean, two things for me. One, at its heart, open banking is about removing friction for customers, right? Think about it. Customers would share their data to make life easier or faster or more valuable. For me, so each conversation always comes back to that. Building on what Wolfgang said, it's absolutely natural that the first steps were aggregation, payments, what's broadly described as PFMs, or personal financial management, where people were trying to help customers to see and understand their money, help them to possibly even change some of their money or budget. The problem with those approaches, or at least in our opinion, is that it injects even more friction into the customer experience. You know, some of the PFM solutions would ask customers to spend hours classifying spend, putting it into buckets, creating budgets, and so forth. And at Upside Saving, my career in financial services, I ran a wealth platform out in Singapore. I've spent a long time in insurance and investment products. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is the biggest issue we have is people just don't want to spend the time to, get their finances in order. That's not because the individual's bad. I suffer from the same. Who wants to sit on a Saturday morning spending 4 hours sorting through bank statements?
Yeah.
So at Upside Saving, what we're trying to do is we're going to try and make saving completely effortless. Give us access to your bank data through open banking, mm-hmm. and we can analyze the data. We can find where the financial inefficiencies are, and we can automatically move the excess cash or the items that you should have managed better. We can convert that into cash and move it into a savings account. So it's almost in the good old gaming days of plug in and play. That's the notion of what we have at Upside Saving.
Thank you, Andres. That's an interesting proposition, and I see myself in these situations where, during weekends, the last thing I want to do, I'm just going to go to my, spending hours, kind of really, I feel like an accountant, and do that kind of work. Can be frustrating sometimes, especially consolidating for different accounts and so on, and credit cards. Great. So I'd like to move over to Gary. Gary, so what's your view on at least from your perspective, and especially in Hong Kong, where we have a more market-driven approach, like and let's say somehow organic, how we want to define it. But so what can you share with us?
Sure. I think like you mentioned, the fact that most Asian markets is actually organic or market-driven. Fundamentally, that changes it all, right? We're not seeing a lot of the initial cases that you would see in UK around aggregation and financial management, because simply there's no data sharing across banks, so to speak. But mainly it's bank driven or partnership driven. So banks would lead their individual kind of strategies around open banking. We've seen a wide kind of variety of it. So some banks are using it more as a distribution, so increasing the distribution network. Others are actually, looking at starting their own marketplaces. So trying to link in with some of the ecosystems, and even, if for more adventurous kind of banks out there, they're targeting even adjacent kind of ecosystem. So, right, something outside of banking. There's finance involved, like travel or looking at, purchasing cars, or like helping business banking, companies look at improving their back office, right? So different ways of using open banking data to kind of increase the stickiness or improve the user experience for their own customers, right? Yeah.
Interesting.
So I think that's the key trend.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. I like to move now to Mary. Mary, from your side, you are kind of the link, right, between both. You have experience. You worked in Europe, and then moving now to Asia Pac. What's your view?
All right, so I'll try to pick up on a few of the themes. Maybe starting with on the use case front, something that Wolfgang mentioned earlier, and also the poll is showing that clearly there's a lot of interest in what are use cases for open banking outside of purely banking, even though many of the most, I'd say the most appealing and immediate to understand use cases still are in retail banking. We're in the lucky position of we have a platform with clients from a really wide array of industries, and we're seeing some really, I think the fact that open banking in Europe at least is is gaining awareness due to the regulatory support that it's getting, has meant that industries that previously were not necessarily willing to touch or even considering using bank data are now coming on board. So, we're looking at e-commerce marketplaces using bank information in actually very non-cannibalizing, non-competitive ways to banks, which I think should be good news to anyone in the audience listening from a commercial perspective or from a commercially driven market, where you have large businesses who use banking data or could make use of banking data in their processes internally, for example, to verify accounts of merchants or to make sure that when they're paying out money to participants on their e-commerce platform, it's not falling foul of any money laundering regulations. So I think that's a big area of growth that we're seeing. And that's the data side. I think the other big area of growth and excitement for us is that, open banking, now we're really in Europe starting to see it go beyond read access only. We're starting to see it go towards write access. And initially in Europe, that starts with payment initiation, but in APAC, actually the exciting developments in both the likes of Australia, but then also some of the more market-driven economies is that write access is being seen more broadly. It's being seen as, well, you have banks who provide financial products, and obviously it's in their interest to, banks want more customers, banks want more people to use their financial products. And they're starting to see it as an opportunity, for example, to provide account opening APIs or account management APIs and write access APIs that go beyond just payments. Although even payment initiation on its own is already, in some sense, if I'm the banker, I see it as a feature that where I can tell my customers, if you use my account, it is more powerful because you'll be able to integrate it with all these external services. Whereas if you use this other account, if it doesn't enable payment initiation, it means that there are a bunch of services that won't work for you. And that narrative, I think, is playing out. I'm at least seeing it play out really well in conversations I have with banks out here in APAC and commercially driven markets. And so to wrap it up, I think the big difference definitely in APAC is, in a market-driven environment, we are seeing that we have to work harder and be smarter about explaining to the bank why it's in their interest to be involved. Even though I believe that even in Europe, where it's regulatory driven, it's in their interest to be involved. The alternative is that they're going to not see any part of the value that's going to be created. And I think that's the narrative that's working well in APAC. And that's also the big difference.
Yeah, it's much more value driven in here. As I really explaining what's the value for the bank to essentially, open this API and let, the ecosystem leverage out of it. It's a very interesting view and fascinating also see other use cases. I was actually going to look at our poll here today, looking at what the attendees are looking for to hear more about in terms of use cases. And what I'm seeing, like there are like retail banking is taking forgive me, is actually other use cases beside the banking, like healthcare, insurance, and then there's retail banking and then business banking. Any one of you has any, I'd like to probably have more like also what Wolfgang has mentioned before, use cases outside of banking. I know, Wolfgang, you have experience across different industry, and I know you work with some of them healthcare and insurance as well. What do you see from your side? What's the potential of open banking really tapping into these other industries?
Yeah, so I think there are use cases in quite a few other industries. So, for example, in telecommunication, if you here in the UK want to open a contract with a telco, and you want to get an expensive handset, then basically the telco will want to know that you are effectively able to pay the rates. They'll do a credit check, and they might actually ask you to also show you in a shop, show them your last bank statement. That could actually be done entirely digitally. With open banking, you can ascertain the identity of the applicant. You could ascertain the affordability. You can ascertain that they're actually loan worthy, that their credit rating is okay. You might still want to do an experience check, but if you can see their salary payments come in on a bank statement electronically, then actually that is a good thing. So in areas where identity matters, I think open banking could play a role. In areas where credit checking matters, open banking can play a role. Frankly, whenever you need to use a bank statement currently, you could do that with open banking. I find myself, because in the UK, actually there is no proof of address in an identity card. I find myself using bank statements or utility bills all the time. Instead, you could do an OAuth flow and get your bank to ascertain that you are who you claim to be, and also provide your address information that they have to have on file.
Yeah,
there are ample of use cases in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned it. Actually, this is the utility bill. It's something that you have to have it within 3 months, and I think that will be amazing to have. It's an existing challenge for myself, as to share as terms of as a consumer. I know also Andrew says, you guys, I think, as you shared with me earlier, you guys are doing also within something within that domain, right? You see that happening? Go ahead in your company. What's this? Do you have anything to share regarding that?
Yeah, so Antonio, 2 points I'll share. When we started looking at open banking, going back at least 2 years now, it was sort of starting to become clear that we drew a little 4-grid box. On the one hand, you have individuals. On the other hand, you have small businesses. So there would be benefit or use cases in both of those. And then you have debt or borrowing, and you have savings. The reason why we picked savings and individuals, so 2 of those quadrants specifically, is I looked at just the level of inefficiency in this market. People are not getting any interests on their savings. More than 45% of all money is still held in non-interest bearing accounts in the UK, which is shocking. You have balances of £7,500, which people just have in their current accounts, and it's not working for them. It's just sitting there. And I'm not talking about a small percentage of people. Half of people are doing this, and the other half don't have savings. So it's a scary place to be, but at the same time, a huge opportunity that open banking can bring and unlock lots of value. The second thought I have is what we're starting to see in open banking in the UK is actually that the conversation is shifting more and more towards open finance. Right. We are still at the early days of open banking, but as conferences go, it's always interesting to talk about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And to the point where the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, or the regulator here in the UK, it has got an open consultation going on as we speak about what should be included in open finance and what's the implementation model we should use. And there's a strong case to be made to say, do what we've done with open banking and literally just give it a second gear. And so far, the feedback we're getting is the in-scope conversations are telcos, utility companies, energy companies, broadband, mobile providers, insurance company, pension companies. So I'm delighted to see people are interested about the other use cases, because so are we. We see savings as the first gear, but there are so many other inefficiencies where people are not struggling. PwC recently did a report where they talked just about the price equation and the fact that people don't take the effort to compare the best services for their needs, and the inefficiency that creates is £8 billion that people are paying every year for services they either don't use or I don't know need. It's too much capacity or the incorrect fit. So there's huge amounts of value in that adjacent use cases, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. And I'd like to have the view of Mary on this. Like, so Mary, how do you see from, from your side as a connecting the banks and the ecosystem, what's your experience with the other industries beside banking?
So right now, our platform is very much focused on banking APIs, but as Andre says, I think there are two areas. One is that within Europe, the open finance conversation is ongoing, and actually, if anyone is interested in reading our response to that, feel free to contact me afterwards. So that's a really important one for anyone who is interested in learning which areas are in scope. And then broadly across the world, so if I look at Australia, for instance, Australia approached their open banking journey with the learnings from Europe in mind, and really thought of it broadly as an initiative, as a consumer data right to make data work for Australians, and is looking at banking initially, and within banking actually going more broad in the set of products that are in scope. And then telco and utilities are already in development for the next phases. I think one part that's really crucial for me in my remit as someone looking at APAC is that when I look at the parts of APAC, Southeast Asia, for instance, where you have a larger population of unbanked or underbanked people, it's not like those people don't have financial relationships. It's just that those financial relationships happen with different, perhaps non-bank entities. If I'm an underbanked person in Indonesia, I will still have a fairly complex financial life with phone contracts and water bills and electricity bills, and understanding how that data could be made use of, or wallet data, and essentially saying, well, where are the locations that the data sits in, whether it's with a bank or with a non-bank entity? What could that data be used for, whether it's credit scoring, identity verification, fact checking, easier account opening? So the various use cases we're seeing, where is that data sitting, and how can we make it accessible in a normalized way? I think that's kind of where we see on the data side being able to provide value, but that's also where I see from a use case perspective the large potential in APAC, and so I think that's where banks will have a large role to play, because it's almost like in Europe they said, let's start with the most difficult industry, which is financial services, where you have the highest bar of security and the highest pushback. And the lowest level of natural competition, perhaps. But if you can get that going, then you can get the utilities and the wallets and the other sources of data going as well. So that's the promise here.
I see that the open finance as a time back into the conversation of what Andres brought up. I see that coming on more and more common. Having the open finance discussion is open banking is sort of obsolete now. So looking ahead, where are these next use cases coming from? How we should take that approach, and really, as you say, Mary, like really focusing on Australia, and okay, we start from data, from user data, right, and financial service first, and then expanding everywhere. So this is going to be really fascinating to see what's going to happen next. Going back to in the meantime, just for the audience, we see if you go to Pigeonhole and just vote the questions that we'll be tackling next. Before we go actually to next question, I'd like to actually have Gary's input on one of the actual areas. We have already touched retails and so on, but the one I know, Gary, you have experience in the past in the commercial banking. So what do you see there as an opportunity, right?
Sure. I think there's actually more opportunity on commercial or business banking than retail, to be honest. There's really a lot of different use cases and things that we could do on commercial side. I think definitely in terms of running a business, right? You can think of endless things that you need to consider. So I think a lot of people have looked at how open banking can help run your business in a much more efficient way. So we're getting into, things you can imagine even for people running ad ad hoc jobs. As and when a payment comes in, they can get a message into Slack, and Slack can then kind of signal to you that this project is funded, and then you can start, right? So, or you can even go into using different banks' data to kind of associate different SMEs and see if they can network together and provide different supply chain solutions or opportunities between business networks. So there's really a lot of things that banks can actually do to help different companies and businesses run in a much more efficient way. So yeah, I think there's really so many cases that we could do, and a lot of the businesses are struggling to these days to automate a lot of their processes, right? So in Hong Kong, a lot of companies are still manually kind of reconciling their payables and receivables, etc., or they're struggling to find different suppliers or buyers in different markets. And I think analyzing the bank data and using that more effectively, then you can really kind of support the whole business industry.
Yeah, from a reconciliation perspective, there is a lot of work that can be done there, and we see a lot of companies actually really doing that somehow, right? With from as shared like platform banking perspective, really, it's really. But I see the opportunities, as you mentioned, like really interesting to see what's going to happen in the future. Also from a trade finance perspective, I think would be interesting to see. So let's move to the some of the questions that are coming from our audience here. So I think I can see that things are shifting around here on the screen for us. So I would like to start with probably the most popular one. That looks like what are the benefits that what benefits can open banking bring to the ecosystem, right? It's a very broad question, I think. Maybe shall we start? Wolfgang, do you want to go ahead since I go ahead with you?
Yeah, sure.
Share your view on this.
So we've seen, particularly in these last 2 to 3 months, a very, very heavy shift from traditional interactions with businesses to digital interactions with businesses. Shops have been closed and branches have been closed, and my local nationwide branch here in Hampstead has a big poster in the window: only come in if you really, really have to. So one of the benefits that open banking can bring is to enable the shift to digital interactions also outside banking. And to basically provide the data in a trustworthy manner, in a privacy preserving manner, to other organizations, so that their processes become a lot more efficient, and that they can serve their customers a lot better. So I think one of the key benefits that open banking can bring is efficiency, and as Andres said, remove friction. Thanks,
Wolfgang. I see we have another question coming in, but I'd like to move on to Andres and see what's your view in terms of how do you see that really can benefit the ecosystem, open banking benefit the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Wolfgang summarized it. Pace and and ease of use, both whether it's an individual using a solution. We talked about utility bills or signing up or onboarding journeys. With even today, I'm on 31 apps tracking different use cases, and I can now, within 4 seconds and 3 taps, I can give that company access to my bank data. I don't have to fill in forms. I don't have to call to someone. Even my accountants now demand access to this, so that they can go through my transactions before they ask me silly questions around my personal tax. You know, so just getting things done and so much faster. But not just that, you know, from an ecosystem perspective, companies like Marie's and TrueLayer allow us to innovate together much quicker. I mean, I'll be very selfish and talk about, you know, upside. If we had to integrate into 74 banks in the UK, it would have taken me 4 years. If I even just getting one bank to, you know, go through the procurement hassle, the security checks, the due diligence, honestly, you cannot imagine being able to do the same things. So what these platforms have done is they've allowed us all, small and large, to innovate so much faster. You know, we all talk lean and testing a few things and see what works. Well, you know, in its truest sense, we needed open banking to enable this in financial services. Otherwise, you know, and I come from a background where I also worked in large organizations, and I know how just damn hard it was to get stuff done. You know, we've just got a massive rocket for innovation here.
Thanks, Andres. Yeah, I think so. We have another question here, which I like to actually address directly to Mary, which is so winners set rules. Will incumbent banks get digital at scale, or will fintech, techfin challengers get distribution at scale? Who will win and why? It's a good question.
Right. So the reason I kind of put my hand up for that one is I love the difference between the ecosystem question and this question, because it's such a descriptive, it's such a great way to see the mindset shift that I think, I mean, look at this webinar, right? We have an upstart, we have a challenge, we have a technology platform, we have a you know, as you called it, old world bank, talking together about how we're going to make things work and how we're going to figure out who gets what and why. And I think that's, for me, you know, this kind of conversation without initiatives around open banking would not have been happening. We would have had the banks talking in their little bubble and the fintechs talking in their little bubble without learning from each other. And so in our view, or I guess definitely in my view, but as a market enabler, we see the rising tide really lifting all boats. So for me, it's not as adversarial as this question implies, I would say. And then specifically around who will win and why, I think the question there is, you know, who is going to come up with the most valuable use cases to make it worthwhile for people to use and to create more value. And I think there, you know, if incumbent banks get their heads around how to innovate on these new platforms and how to innovate by making their own infrastructure more available, they'll be in a really good place. And the most forward-thinking banks we're talking to are starting to think about how to future-proof their model from going from a world where they are a vault of money that gets lent out and paid back to going to becoming a provider of identity and data and turning that into their main revenue source, or at least part of their revenue source to be future-proof, because they have that distribution and they have that trust. And say what you will about lack of trust in banks, most people still to this day like to put their money somewhere that has a serif font and 170 years of experience in business. And on the flip side, the fintechs, I think, increasingly are collaborating, and in a world where you have API connections, you have to collaborate. So it's not as adversarial.
Yeah, that's also my question. See, like, when it comes to aggregating account, it's somehow it's not really risky for the end user to actually give them the account number until you can just view, right, my data. But then it's interesting to see when it comes then to actually triggering transaction, right? So how that is going to play, right? Will the consumers trust the fintechs to be able to do that? So that would be interesting to see. I'd like to have your view actually still on this question again and see, what do you think?
Sure. I think to be honest, one key point, right? If we can collectively kind of educate everyone to be aware of what open banking can do, and then the benefits of it, I think both sides will win. I don't think it's a us or them kind of mentality, right? Right now, I think it's a collective challenge to look at what's the value add that we want to bring to the customers, right? not just in terms of customer experience, right? I think the key difference between a bank and a fintech is the funding model, right? Unfortunately, banks are not funded just to collect, good user experience and different, different metrics, right? Very different metrics. And fintechs, when they approach me in terms of talking about customer experience, I think that's definitely a given. But I think we all need to understand, the both worlds, right? We need to have a sustainable model. We need to educate customers into why they should be doing this stuff. And if we can collectively do it, in Asia especially, people still trust the banks. There's still a lot of trust and loyalty to the banks, and there's a reason for that, because there's high competition, and then there's always been security level in the banks, right? So I think definitely we need to work together on this and bring up the whole industry.
Yeah, the reputation is a key factor, right? So and the trust, in the many years in the business adds a lot of kind of increases the level of confidence for the end user, and this will be very interesting to see how that plays out. I think, Andres, do you want to share anything else? Anything from your side, from your perspective on this question?
I mean, look, I never think of it as, category choice, or whether it's traditional incumbents or whether it's new digital players. I don't think about that. I believe the individual companies that translate the most value to customers will win. It's as simple as that. Whether they are big, small, new, old, in my mind at least, is irrelevant. Yes, there are problems either way, right? If you're small, you don't have the distribution. If you're large, you have too much distribution, and vice versa. But, I think at the end of the day, what I love about this webinar and why I'm involved is the constant talk of the use cases. What is it that the customers want, need, and will use? And that is what will ultimately drive, the open banking over the threshold where it becomes pervasive. One of the earlier conversations we had was around, should it be state-led or regulatory-led or just market-driven? Either way, it needs a catalyst. It needs some level of adoption in users, where then suddenly it becomes undeniable and it becomes a market trend. We saw that in payment networks. We saw that in previous banking rails. We saw that in card-linked schemes and networks. Open banking will be no different. We are still all looking for that one thing which drives us across the threshold, and then the rest is history.
Yeah, it's a great point. We've seen already this like socio-economic phenomenon happening across other industries, right? But it's interesting, in an industry like financial services, where is heavily regulated, very based on trust on how that is going to play out. And I'm with you on this, seeing, eventually, the best customer experience, which will win, right? Because on today's users are really let's say somehow, obviously I use the word spoiled by the other industries, like social media. It's really driving that change, and people are becoming more and more digital savvy. So that really sets the foundation from customer experience from a digital perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I was looking at next questions. I see a lot of tiles moving around here. Okay, we have another one with the 5 votes. Or before I move there, Wolfgang, do you want to share something on this point, or you would like me to move to the next point?
Well, I've just been before the tile shifted, thinking about my answer to the adoption by first movers.
Yeah, go with that. We can cover that first.
Yeah. Let's just do that. So if they had a choice, the large banks, certainly in the UK, would have not freely implemented any open banking APIs. They, I think, broadly saw this as as a cost with almost no upside potential. The banks really didn't do very much at all to drive the adoption of open banking. I mean, yes, they did account aggregation, but I don't think they made any significant amount of money out of open banking, and instead they had a huge cost having to roll it out. So the successes will actually come out of relatively nimble organizations who can innovate reasonably quickly. And I don't think the successes will come broadly. There may of course be exceptions, but broadly will not come out of large banks that had to implement PSD2. Yeah, so I think the drive of adoption will not fundamentally come out of the main high street banks. The drive of adoption will come out of small, nimble startups like Upside and Revolut and others. And ultimately, it remains to be seen whether they can actually make enough money out of the adoption of open banking to survive. I mean, there were a fair number of Dear Chairman letters to startup banks last year from the regulator suggesting that they should actually start worrying about where their revenue and where their income is going to come from. And this is despite the presence of extensive use of open banking.
Andrew, you got anything to add from your side on this?
Just very quickly, and specifically on the second part of that question around, some of the successes at driving adoption. Notwithstanding the human tragedy around the current COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a huge uptick in SMEs giving their accounting packages access to open banking. For numerous of reasons, but accountants, had to furlough staff, they had to find new ways, so they had to just be more efficient. They couldn't get bank statements to be transferred in. Also, in the UK, there was a load of government initiatives, the Future Fund, C-bills, various different loan schemes and so forth, which required people to move extremely quickly. And open banking as a use case it jumped. I mean, we getting reports from the open banking implementation entity that adoption spiked 40% since the start of the year, which is phenomenal. Similarly, we also know that the government has reached into some of these entities to get some high-level information to understand what the impact is, how many loans are being applied for, et cetera, et cetera. If you had to do that old ways of manual reporting and data sharing, it would never have been possible in this time. So again, despite human tragedy, the COVID-19 has been a catalyst for adoption, especially in the UK, we've seen.
Thanks, Andres. I wanted to move to next question. Perhaps I was thinking, Mary, would you be? It's a very interesting question related to data in not only open banking, OpenX, where it says banks are at the forefront to share. Oh, here we go. We have a larger view now. So I was saying banks are at the forefront to share their data. Where do we see reciprocity on the open banking or OpenX, basically cross sector, across industry? How do we measure value from non-banks data?
Yep, great question. I think there are a few places where, so in Europe, as Wolfgang said, obviously there was regulatory pressure that forced banks to open up their data, and whether you believe that's fair or not, like that's the way it was handled in Europe. in APAC, if you're looking at, for instance, Australia, they very explicitly had the concept of reciprocity built in from the get-go. And if you are an authorized data holder and someone requests data from you and has equivalent data, they're starting to build in a legal framework for receiving equivalent data back. And I think ultimately it's always a question of who pays for what, and whether you pay in money or data is kind of an implementation detail. I think in Europe so far, everything that's in scope has to be provided for free, which does create certain challenges and creates this sense of imbalance. For anything that goes beyond the regulatory scope, you can then either, and in our conversations with banks, it's really the interesting conversation is now happening around premium APIs, where anything that goes beyond the scope, we either create a commercial model that works for them, and in a sense, that's actually very much what happens in APAC. It's a commercial model where the bank sees a commercial reason to do it, and in a way, it makes our life easier because then there's aligned incentives. Or you exchange value in the form of data, and you look at credit bureaus. The principles of reciprocity are very well understood there. You get as much data out of the credit bureau as you put in. So that's not a new setup. It just so happens that when you're looking at, let's say, an innovator in APAC who's from a totally different industry, they may not have equivalent data, or it may be very difficult to allocate value and say, well, this transaction history of 3 years is worth as much as
right.
I don't know, a loan data for the last 5 years. So and that's within just financial data. When you expand it to, let's say, marketplace data, if you're a marketplace like a Uber, Deliveroo, Amazon, whatever, like how do you find data that's equivalent to the banking data that's shared? That's kind of tricky. So in a sense, I prefer the simple old, we'll pay you for the data approach.
Interesting. I'm cautious of time. We got probably only 2 minutes left, but I'd like to have a view of Gary. Do you have anything to share on this point?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of the measuring the value, right? I think sometimes it's not just on the data itself. I think looking at the cases I've dealt with in Hong Kong, it's really about what else can different organizations help to help each other, right? So the go-to-market strategy. So if I'm sharing the data to you, then what is the value added to the end customer? Obviously, it would be great if you also have valuable data to share back and help me on credit models and let's say that government opens up tax information. I could think of 100 things I could streamline in the bank, right? So, but yeah, I think apart from data sharing, it's also collectively working with the partners to kind of communicate to the end user and educate them on why they need to share this data.
Thanks, Gary. And with this last question, I think we are at the end of our webinar. We are out of time. I think it's 7:30 p.m. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to answer all their questions. We'll do our best to see whether we can do this offline. I just wanted to thank you, first of all the panelists that to making the time and be on this call tonight, and also to the attendees. Thank you so much, and please stay tuned. Follow us on LinkedIn, and to stay updated on the next upcoming webinars. And I wish all of you a great night and have a great rest of the week. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure, Antonio.
Thank you.